All right, so we're going to move a little bit ahead and introduce some advanced concepts in this lesson, but I promise we're going to come back and tie it all together very soon. Here's the business challenge I have for you today. What if I want to emulate the functionality of the component will mount and component will unmount lifecycle methods without the functionality of the component did update lifecycle method? In other words, in hooks land, what if I only want the useEffect function to run when the component first appears and right before it disappears? What if I want any re-renders, for example, if the state changes or the props change and the counter component re-renders, what if I want that re-render not to trigger this effect to run? And let me give you a real-life use case that might be kind of a good example of why we might want to do this. Imagine making something like a single API request. The component loads and we need to fetch some information from a backend. If we put that logic somewhere here like line number 9 to make that API request, well then every single time the state and props change and the component re-renders and the useEffect hook runs again, well then every single time we're going to be running this logic and every single time we're going to be making that API request for the very same data. And that is obviously very inefficient. We're making a lot of extra requests to the backend for information that we don't need. So what we want to do here, of course, is set up an initial API request, but also make sure that the component knows that it's just for a one-time use and that it shouldn't make that request again. It should only make it when the component mounts for the first time. And to add on to that, to kind of only execute useEffect when the component mounts and or unmounts. So any of the middle or in between the kind of existence of the component, if you will, we don't want useEffect to run. How can we set up something like that? Well, the solution is passing an empty array as the second argument to the useEffect hook. So let's take a look at that in action. So what I'm going to do here is on line 14, I'm going to put a comma and then provide an empty array as the second argument to my useEffect hook. So as a reminder, the first argument is the entire callback function. It's this entire chunk of code that I have from line 8 to 14. That constitutes my entire first argument to the useEffect hook. Then I simply put a comma and provide my second argument, which is an empty array. And I know what you're thinking, what does this empty array mean? It's kind of confusing, but just stick with it for now because I want to take a look at this in action. And then in the next lesson, I'm going to actually show you what this array is responsible for and kind of connect it to the concept of why an empty array accomplishes the effect that we want. Before we take a look at this in the browser, I want to add some additional text inside these console logs just to make it clear about what's happening. So right here, I'm going to keep this, I'm inside the useEffect function, but I'm going to add on a little sentence afterwards that just says, I will only run upon mounting. So when the component first appears or when it first renders to the screen. And right here in this return function, my teardown function, I'm just going to put here, I'm removing anything that was set up above. The last count was count. And then let's put another sentence here like, but now I will only run when component is being unmounted. Pretty simple, of course, just some arbitrary text to remind us what's going on when we take a look at the console in a few seconds. So I'm going to save this and our page is going to refresh and we can take a look at this component in the browser. So I'll begin by clicking the button to show our counter component, and this is the first time the useEffect hook is going to run, and we're going to get our console log from line number 9. I'm inside the useEffect function. I will only run upon mounting. This is the big difference with what happens whenever we pass an array as the second argument to useEffect. From this point forward, whenever our component re-renders, for example, when I click one of these increase or decrease buttons and the state changes and the visual UI changes because the component re-renders, at this point, the useEffect hook will not run again. And I can show it in action. I'm just going to click increase a couple times and decrease a couple times. You can take a look at the right side. Nothing is changing, which means that useEffect is not running its effect. What that also means is that our original teardown function that we returned the first time that useEffect ran when the component was first mounted, this is still being held in memory. React is still keeping track of this, but it's not actually executing it. And the only time it's actually going to execute this return function, this teardown function, is whenever we complete the teardown with an unmounting. So when useEffect runs for the last time, or in other words, when the return function runs for the last time, because the component is being removed. So none of these button clicks will change anything, but as soon as I hide the counter component and make it invisible, in other words, remove it from the DOM, at this point, we're going to see I'm removing anything that was set up above, and you'll notice it says the last count was 0. No matter what number we actually displayed there, it's always going to be 0, and I want to show you one more time why this is so. So I'm going to clear this, and once again, I'm going to open this, and I'm just going to increase this to something like 8 or 9, and click it again, and you'll notice it still says 0. The reason it says 0 is because remember, this return function is kind of being logged or being kept track of whenever useEffect runs for the first time, whenever the component mounts. And at that juncture, at that moment, the value of count is 0. And as count is changing, as we're incrementing it with the buttons, and it's going to 1 and 2 and 3, etc., this useEffect hook is not running, and so the teardown function is not being run in favor of a brand new effect to be instituted. Rather, React is still keeping track of the old, original, initial return function that it logged whenever useEffect ran for the first time. And that is that function that is executed whenever we unmount the component, and that function, again, retains a value of count at that point as being 0, right? And that's why we're seeing 0 here instead of 9, which was the last value we saw on screen. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. In this lesson, we talked about how we can limit the useEffect hook to run only when a component mounts or unmounts. In other words, how we can prevent re-renders from triggering a useEffect hook from running. All we have to do is pass an empty array as the second argument to the useEffect hook. In the next lesson, we're going to dive into more detail about what this array represents, what it's keeping track of, and how we can use it to manipulate more on how useEffect is running. So the next lesson is one of my most favorite ones in the course, so I look forward to it, and I will see you there.